Telling my sister wives that I'm leaving. This isn't going to be a surprise.
This is just a big announcement. If women are not married to the same man, you're not a sister wife anymore.
The moment the gift was rejected, everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. For viewers of Sister Wives, Christmas has always been more than a holiday. It's been a pressure test, a moment when fractured relationships are forced into the same emotional space. And this time, the test didn't just expose distance, it confirmed finality. Kody Brown believed a gesture could still repair something that had already broken. A gift, a note, a final attempt to reinsert himself into a space he no longer occupied emotionally. But the response wasn't anger, it was rejection. And rejection, when it's calm, is devastating. The gift didn't land the way Kody expected. It wasn't received with gratitude, curiosity, or even irritation. It was dismissed, not because it lacked value, but because the relationship itself no longer held any. That's the part viewers felt immediately, even if they couldn't name it. This wasn't about a present. It was about access. For years, Kody had been used to his presence defining the moment, his words setting the tone, his expectations shaping the outcome. Holidays revolved around him, his rules, his conditions, his version of togetherness. Christmas was no exception. But this time, something was different. The dynamic had shifted so far that even a symbolic offering couldn't cross the emotional boundary that had already been drawn. The rejection wasn't impulsive, it wasn't spiteful, it was considered. And that's why it hurt more. What made this moment so striking wasn't just that the gift was refused, it was how it was refused. Quietly, firmly, without negotiation, without explanation that asked for understanding. And then there was the note. The note was meant to soften the gesture, to frame it, to control the narrative. Kody has always relied on words to reassert emotional relevance. When actions failed, explanations followed. When explanations failed, blame shifted. But this note didn't do what he thought it would. Instead of opening a door, it exposed something raw, a disconnect so wide that even sentiment felt intrusive. The words meant to bridge distance only highlighted how little room there was left to cross it. Viewers immediately sensed it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't miscommunication. This was closure being enforced. The rejection of the gift signaled something far bigger than holiday tension. It revealed that Kody's emotional authority, the power to define meaning in the family, was gone. And that loss of authority is what made the note feel savage, not because it was cruel, but because it failed. In earlier seasons, a note like that might have triggered a discussion, a negotiation, a recentering of Kody's role. But now it landed in a space where his words no longer carried weight. That's a terrifying realization for someone who once controlled the emotional rhythm of an entire family. Christmas amplified it. Because holidays don't allow emotional distance to hide. They force alignment or reveal separation. And this Christmas made one thing clear. The separation was no longer temporary, emotional, or negotiable. It was structural. The rejection wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about making a point. It was about boundaries being enforced without apology. And when boundaries are enforced calmly, they're rarely reversed. That's what Kody didn't anticipate. He expected emotion. He expected reaction. He expected engagement. What he got instead was indifference. And indifference is the true opposite of love. The note, once revealed, only reinforced that reality, not because of what it said, but because of how unnecessary it felt. It arrived too late, attached to a role that no longer existed. Kody was no longer the emotional gatekeeper, no longer the central figure, no longer the one whose gestures defined the moment. Christmas had moved on with him. And that's the part that made this moment final. Because gifts can be returned, words can be ignored, but emotional relevance once lost doesn't come back quietly. This wasn't a fight. It was a confirmation. A confirmation that the family had emotionally reorganized, and Kody was no longer at the center of it. The rejected gift wasn't the cause of the breakdown, it was the proof. And once that proof surfaced, everything that followed, the note, the reaction, the silence, only made one truth harder to deny. It was over. Not announced, not argued, just revealed. To understand why this moment cut so deeply, you have to understand what the gift was really meant to do. It wasn't about Christmas. It was about reclaiming relevance. Kody has always used gestures as leverage, not in a transactional way, but in a symbolic one. A gift, a note, a carefully chosen moment. These were tools he relied on to reassert emotional balance when things felt like they were slipping. In the past, they worked because the family still recognized his authority to define meaning. This time, that authority was gone. The gift wasn't random, it was chosen with intention. It carried the assumption that the relationship still existed in a form that could be accessed, that there was still an emotional door open, maybe not wide, but unlocked enough for a knock to matter. That assumption was wrong. What Kody failed to recognize was that the family had already moved past the stage where gestures could substitute for accountability. The emotional math had changed. In earlier years, effort, even late effort, was enough to spark engagement. Now, effort without presence felt hollow, and the gift exposed that gap. From Kody's perspective, the gesture was a test, a way to see if he still had influence, if the connection, even strained, could still be activated on his terms. Christmas felt like the perfect opportunity because holidays carry built-in emotional permission. They're moments where people expect outreach, where attempts at connection are often tolerated, even if they're awkward. But tolerance isn't connection, and the family had stopped confusing the two. The rejection of the gift wasn't reactive, it wasn't impulsive. It was the result of a longer internal decision that had already been made. By the time Christmas arrived, emotional boundaries weren't being considered anymore. They were already in place. That's what made the rejection feel so definitive. Kody expected the gift to reopen a conversation, even a tense one. He expected emotion, gratitude, frustration, resentment, something. Emotion would have meant engagement. Engagement would have meant possibility. Instead, he got closure. The absence of emotional response was louder than any argument could have been. It signaled that the family no longer felt obligated to participate in moments he initiated, that his timing, his framing, and his intentions no longer set the terms. That shift didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of uneven emotional labor, years of rules that applied selectively, years of presence that felt conditional. By the time Kody reached for symbolism, the family had already moved into a phase where symbolism felt manipulative rather than meaningful. The gift didn't fail because it was insufficient. It failed because it was irrelevant, and that irrelevance was devastating. What made this moment even more revealing was the expectation behind it. Kody believed that Christmas still belonged to him in some way, that it was still a shared emotional space he could enter, even briefly. The rejection made it clear that the holiday, and the family structure around it, had been redefined without him. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. The family had learned that peace required boundaries, that participation came with costs they were no longer willing to pay. Accepting the gift would have reopened a dynamic they had already closed, and they knew it. This is where the power shift becomes unmistakable. Power isn't about control in the obvious sense. It's about who gets to initiate and who feels obligated to respond. For years, Kody initiated and others adjusted. This time, the adjustment didn't happen. The family didn't feel the need to manage his feelings anymore. That's the real loss. When someone no longer feels responsible for your emotional reaction, your influence disappears. The rejection of the gift wasn't personal, it was structural. It showed that the emotional hierarchy had collapsed. And then there was the note. The note was supposed to do what the gift couldn't, to contextualize, to soften, to reassert intention. Kody has always relied on language to reframe moments after the fact, to explain why something should be interpreted differently than it initially felt. But this time, the note only highlighted how out of sync he was. The words didn't land as thoughtful, they landed as intrusive. Not because they were harsh, but because they assumed a level of intimacy that no longer existed. They spoke to a relationship that had already been mourned. That's why the note felt savage to viewers, not because it was cruel, because it was unnecessary. It arrived after the emotional door had closed. It tried to negotiate a boundary that had already been enforced. And instead of reopening anything, it confirmed how far apart the two sides had become. Kody believed the note would clarify his intentions. What it actually clarified was the gap between how he saw the relationship and how the family experienced it. That gap is fatal, because reconciliation requires shared reality, and this moment proved there wasn't one anymore. The gift and the note together created a snapshot of misalignment, Kody operating from an old script, the family responding from a new one, neither side speaking the same emotional language anymore. And when languages don't match, communication fails.
This is why the rejection didn't spark a fight. There was nothing left to argue about. The decision had already been made internally. Christmas didn't change it. It revealed it. The power of this moment lies in its restraint. No yelling, no confrontation, no dramatic refusal. Just a quiet, firm boundary that said, this no longer belongs here. That's the kind of ending that doesn't get reversed. Because it isn't fueled by anger. It's fueled by clarity, and clarity doesn't negotiate. By the time the gift was rejected and the note was revealed, the outcome was already sealed. What followed wasn't escalation, it was confirmation. Kody didn't lose the family because the gift was rejected. The gift was rejected because he had already lost the family. And once that reality surfaced, every attempt to reconnect only made the distance more visible.
What made the note feel so cutting wasn't the language itself, it was the timing. Notes carry weight when they arrive inside an active relationship. They clarify tone, they soften intent, they provide emotional framing. But when a relationship has already moved into emotional distance, words don't land the same way. They don't feel comforting. They feel intrusive. That's what happened here.
The note wasn't harsh, it wasn't overtly manipulative, it didn't insult or threaten. On paper, it could even be read as thoughtful. But thoughtfulness only works when it's welcome, and this note arrived in a space where consent, emotional consent, had already been withdrawn. Kody wrote from a position that no longer existed. He wrote as if the relationship was strained but intact, as if a reset was still possible, as if the right combination of explanation and sentiment could reopen a door that had quietly closed long before Christmas. Viewers felt that disconnect immediately, because while the note assumed shared emotional ground, the rejection of the gift proved there was none. This is where language backfires. Words don't just communicate meaning, they signal position. They reveal how the speaker sees themselves in relation to the listener, and this note revealed that Kody still saw himself as someone entitled to be heard. That entitlement is subtle but unmistakable. It showed up in the assumption that his explanation mattered, that his feelings still required processing, that his version of the story still deserved space in the moment, and that assumption was no longer shared. The family had already moved into a different emotional posture, one where explanations weren't needed because decisions had already been made. That's why the note felt savage to viewers. Not because it was cruel, because it missed the moment entirely. It arrived late, framed for an audience that had already emotionally disengaged. And when language arrives out of sync, it doesn't heal, it exposes. What the note exposed most clearly was Kody's inability to read the room. For years, he relied on verbal framing to reassert control. When tensions rose, he explained. When conflicts escalated, he contextualized. When relationships strained, he narrated. That narration once worked because others were still invested in participating. But participation had ended. The family no longer needed his explanations to make sense of their reality. They had already done the work privately. The note didn't add clarity. It contradicted their lived experience. And contradiction, at this stage, felt dismissive. Viewers recognized this pattern because they'd seen it before. Moments where Kody spoke past others, where he explained instead of listening, where he insisted on being understood without first understanding. This note fit that pattern. It wasn't malicious, it was misaligned. And misalignment feels harsher than hostility. The reaction to the note wasn't explosive because there was nothing left to explode. It was quiet because the emotional negotiation phase was already over. What remained was enforcement. The note crossed a boundary by assuming it hadn't been drawn. That's why it landed the way it did. In earlier seasons, a note like this might have triggered discussion. It might have reopened wounds, but it also might have created space for repair. This time, it did the opposite. It confirmed that Kody was operating from an outdated understanding of the relationship. And nothing accelerates emotional finality like realizing the other person doesn't see the situation the same way you do. This is where the power shift becomes undeniable. Power isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the ability to disengage without explanation. The family didn't need to respond to the note because responding would have implied obligation, and obligation was exactly what they had let go of. That's devastating for someone who once relied on obligation to maintain connection. They also revealed something else, fear. Not overt fear, but the anxiety of someone sensing irrelevance. When people feel their influence slipping, they often reach for language. They explain more, clarify more, justify more. They believe that if they can be understood, they can still matter. But mattering doesn't come from explanation. It comes from presence. And presence had been missing for too long. Viewers didn't react to the content of the note as much as they reacted to what it represented. A last attempt to reassert authority into a space that no longer recognized it. A bid for engagement in a dynamic that had already moved on. That's why the note felt uncomfortable to watch. It wasn't dramatic enough to be entertaining. It wasn't sincere enough to be healing. It existed in a limbo that highlighted how far apart the two sides had become. And that limbo is painful, because it reveals that the breakup didn't happen in one moment. It happened over time, quietly.
Incrementally. And by the time the note arrived, it was addressing a relationship that no longer existed in the present tense. It was speaking to memory. That's the hardest realization of all. The note wasn't rejected because it was wrong. It was rejected because it was late. And lateness, in emotional terms, is unforgiving. Once people move on internally, words lose their power. Explanations feel like noise. Sentiment feels like pressure. And attempts to reconnect feel like interruptions rather than invitations. The note revealed that Kody hadn't fully accepted that shift yet. The family had. And that difference in acceptance created the final break. This moment wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment.
and alignment was gone. By the time viewers saw the note for what it was, the conclusion felt unavoidable. The gift didn't fail. The note didn't fail. They arrived after the ending. And endings that happen quietly don't announce themselves with drama. They reveal themselves in moments like this. Moments where words fall flat, where gestures feel misplaced, where the absence of response says more than any argument ever could. This was one of those moments, and it confirmed what many viewers already suspected. It really was over. When viewers saw the note, the reaction was immediate, but not in the way Kody likely expected. There wasn't outrage first. There wasn't sympathy. There was recognition. Audiences recognized the moment for what it was, a power shift made visible. That's why so many labeled the note savage, not because of cruelty in the words, but because of the imbalance they revealed. The note wasn't savage in intent, it was savage in outcome. It exposed a reality Kody hadn't fully accepted yet, and viewers had. For years, fans of Sister Wives had watched subtle changes in the family dynamic. Less warmth, less patience, more distance, more quiet exits instead of confrontations. By the time this Christmas arrived, many viewers already sensed that emotional negotiations were over. So when the note appeared, it didn't read as heartfelt. It read as out of sync. Commentary online didn't focus on the wording itself. Instead, it focused on the audacity of the gesture. Not audacity in a moral sense, but in a relational one. The assumption that a note could still shape the moment felt outdated. Viewers weren't offended. They were done. This reaction marked a shift in how audiences engaged with Kody's role. In earlier seasons, even critics expected him to explain himself. They waited for his perspective. They debated his intentions. This time, many didn't care what the note said. They cared that it existed. Because the existence of the note suggested Kody still believed he was entitled to an audience, and that belief no longer matched the emotional reality viewers had been watching unfold. This is where audience perception becomes powerful. Reality TV doesn't just show relationships, it trains viewers to recognize patterns. Over time, fans learn the emotional language of the show. They can tell when someone is fighting, negotiating, withdrawing, or done. And this note read as negotiation in a season of withdrawal. That mismatch is why it landed so poorly. Online discussions reflected this clearly. Instead of debating whether the note was fair or unfair, many commentators focused on boundaries. They talked about how accepting the gift or even engaging with the note would have reopened dynamics that had already caused harm. In other words, viewers didn't see rejection as cruelty. They saw it as self-protection. That framing matters. It shows how far audience empathy had shifted. In the past, boundaries were often portrayed as punishments. Now they were understood as necessary. The rejection of the gift wasn't seen as vindictive, it was seen as healthy. And that perspective didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of watching emotional labor go unbalanced. Viewers remembered moments when effort flowed in one direction, when apologies replaced accountability, when gestures substituted for presence, when words arrived after damage had already been done. The note fit that pattern too well. So instead of giving Kody the benefit of the doubt, many viewers saw the note as confirmation that he still didn't understand why things had ended, that he was still trying to fix outcomes without addressing causes, and audiences are rarely patient with that. What made this moment especially stark was how little explanation followed. There was no long conversation dissecting the note, no emotional processing scene, no attempt to salvage meaning from it. The lack of reaction was the reaction. Viewers interpreted that silence correctly. Silence in this context wasn't confusion, it was certainty. It signaled that the decision to disengage had already been made and wasn't up for discussion. That's when the word savage took hold.
Not because the response was mean, because it was final. Finality is unsettling to watch, especially when one person is still operating as if negotiation is possible. The note revealed that Kody hadn't caught up emotionally, and watching that gap play out on screen made viewers uncomfortable. Not because they wanted reconciliation, but because they recognized the moment when reconciliation was no longer an option. Audience reaction also revealed something deeper about how power shifts are perceived on reality TV. Power isn't who speaks the loudest, it's who doesn't have to respond. In this moment, the power had shifted decisively away from Kody. The family no longer needed to manage his emotions. They didn't need to soften rejection. They didn't need to explain boundaries. They simply enforced them. And enforcement without explanation is what viewers labeled savage, because it breaks the familiar script. Reality TV usually thrives on reaction, on emotional back and forth, on confrontation and resolution. This moment offered none of that. It offered restraint. And restraint, when unexpected, feels sharp. The audience recognized the restraint as strength. That recognition marked a turning point in how Kody was perceived, not as a misunderstood patriarch or a flawed leader, but as someone arriving late to an ending that had already happened. The note became symbolic, not because of its content, but because of its irrelevance. And irrelevance is the one thing power cannot survive. This moment also reframed Christmas itself. What had once been a stage for forced togetherness became proof that togetherness was no longer being performed. The holiday didn't bring people closer. It revealed who was already gone. By the end of this episode, viewers weren't asking whether the rejection was fair. They were asking why Kody expected a different outcome. That question alone showed how completely the narrative had shifted. The note didn't spark debate. It closed one. And that closure didn't feel dramatic. It felt earned, which is why so many viewers walked away from this moment with the same conclusion. Not shouted, not celebrated, just understood. It was over.
What made this Christmas moment so definitive wasn't the rejection itself. It was the absence of aftermath. In most reality television storylines, rejection leads to confrontation. Hurt feelings demand processing. Silence is temporary, followed by emotional reckoning. But this moment unfolded differently. There was no escalation, no follow-up attempt, no visible effort to repair what had been refused. And that absence told the real story. Endings rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, after all the arguments have already happened internally. By the time something is rejected calmly, the emotional work is already done. This Christmas wasn't the breaking point. It was the confirmation. The family had reached a stage where they no longer needed to explain why the gift didn't belong. Explanation implies doubt. It implies openness to persuasion. This moment carried neither. That's how viewers knew it was final. For years, conflict in sister wives followed a familiar cycle. Tension built, arguments erupted, apologies were offered, boundaries blurred, and the cycle repeated. Even when things looked irreparable, there was always another conversation waiting. This time, there wasn't. The rejection stood alone, unsupported by drama, and that restraint made it powerful. It showed that the family wasn't reacting anymore. They were acting from a settled place. Emotional finality looks like indifference to persuasion. It looks like no longer needing the other person to understand. That's what viewers were watching. Kody's gift and note represented effort, but effort alone doesn't repair damage when trust has been exhausted. By this stage, effort without accountability felt performative. It asked for recognition without offering repair. And the family didn't need recognition anymore. They needed peace. Peace requires boundaries, and boundaries don't come with debate once they're fully formed. This is the part many people misunderstand about endings. They assume the biggest moment, the fight, the argument, the refusal, is what causes the separation. In reality, separation happens long before that. It happens privately, emotionally, often invisibly. By the time the gift was rejected, the separation had already occurred. Christmas simply made it visible. Viewers recognized this because many had lived it themselves. They knew what it looked like when someone stops trying to be understood, when they stop hoping the other person will finally hear them, when they stop explaining their pain because explaining no longer changes anything. That recognition created empathy, not just for the rejection, but for the process that led to it. This wasn't cruelty, it was resolution. The family had reached a place where re-engaging would have reopened wounds they had already worked to close. Accepting the gift would have reintroduced emotional labor they were no longer willing to perform. And that decision wasn't impulsive, it was protective. The lack of emotional reaction afterward confirmed it. There were no attempts to soften the moment, no reassurance offered to ease Kody's discomfort, no effort to manage his response. That management had ended, which is why this moment landed as the true ending for many viewers. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Endings that arrive quietly tend to be permanent. They don't need reinforcement. They don't need validation. They stand on their own. This Christmas moment revealed that the family had crossed from conflict into closure. That transition is subtle but unmistakable once you know what to look for. The gift represented the past. The rejection represented the present. And there was no bridge between them. Kody's expectation that the gesture would matter revealed how far behind he was emotionally. Not maliciously, just out of sync. He was still operating in a space where gestures carried weight. The family had moved into a space where behavior mattered more than symbolism. That mismatch sealed the outcome. Viewers didn't need a confession or a declaration to understand it. The body language, the silence, the lack of response, all of it communicated what words no longer needed to say. The relationship wasn't paused. It was concluded. This moment also reframed everything that came before it. Past arguments, unresolved issues, emotional distance, suddenly they all pointed to this outcome. The Christmas rejection didn't come out of nowhere. It landed exactly where the trajectory had been heading. And once that realization settled in, the story changed. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about acceptance. Acceptance that some relationships don't end in explosions. They end in boundaries, in quiet decisions, in moments where one side stops reaching and the other stops responding. That's harder to dramatize, but far more honest. The audience felt that honesty. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate.
They simply acknowledged it, because many had been waiting for clarity, and clarity finally arrived, not through words, but through action. This Christmas wasn't remembered for the gift that was rejected, it was remembered for what the rejection represented. The end of negotiation, the end of expectation, the end of emotional access. Not announced, not argued, just enforced. And once enforced, it didn't need reinforcement. The story had reached its conclusion. What followed wasn't fallout, it was aftermath. And the aftermath, as viewers would soon see, wasn't loud or chaotic. It was calm, which is how you know it was real. After this Christmas moment, viewers didn't see Kody the same way again. Not because of what he said, not because of what he did, but because of what no longer worked. For a long time, Kody's role in Sister Wives was complicated but central. Even when fans disagreed with him, they still treated him as the emotional axis of the family. His reactions mattered, his approval mattered, his explanations mattered. That changed here. The rejected gift and the ignored note marked the moment when viewers realized Kody no longer shaped outcomes, he reacted to them, and that shift rewired how audiences interpreted everything that followed. Sympathy didn't disappear overnight, but it thinned. Viewers stopped asking why Kody felt hurt and started asking why he expected anything different. That's a crucial change. Once audiences stop granting someone emotional benefit of the doubt, every future action is filtered through skepticism. After this moment, Kody's gestures stopped reading as misunderstood, they started reading as misplaced. His frustration felt repetitive rather than compelling. His explanations felt defensive rather than clarifying. His emotional reactions felt disconnected from the reality others were living in, and viewers noticed. This Christmas rejection became a reference point. Fans used it to reinterpret earlier moments and predict future ones. When Kody spoke about respect, viewers remembered the boundaries he had ignored. When he spoke about loyalty, they remembered the emotional distance he hadn't addressed. When he spoke about reconciliation, they remembered the gift that wasn't wanted. The audience didn't need to be told what changed. They felt it. Reality TV audiences are especially sensitive to authenticity shifts. They can forgive mistakes, they can tolerate hypocrisy for a while, but they struggle with misalignment when someone appears to be operating under rules that no longer exist. That's what this moment exposed. Kody was still speaking from a framework where he expected engagement. The family, and the audience, had moved to a framework where engagement was optional. That's a loss of power no amount of explanation can reverse. From this point on, many viewers stopped framing Kody as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control. Instead, they began seeing him as someone arriving late to consequences that had been building for years. This reframing didn't require outrage, it required recognition, and recognition is quieter than anger. What's striking is how little this shift relied on new information. There was no shocking revelation, no secret exposed, no dramatic confrontation, just a simple boundary enforced during a moment that used to carry emotional leverage. That simplicity made it undeniable. Once viewers internalized that shift, it changed how they engaged with the show itself. Scenes involving Kody were no longer watched for resolution. They were watched for confirmation. Audiences weren't asking, will this get better? They were asking, does he understand yet? And often, the answer felt like no. This gap between perception and reality became increasingly uncomfortable to watch, not dramatic enough to entertain, not hopeful enough to invest in, just sad in a way that felt avoidable if addressed earlier. That discomfort explains why sympathy drained instead of exploding. Viewers didn't turn against Kody with hostility, they turned away with resignation. That's a far more permanent shift, because hostility still cares. Resignation does not. The Christmas rejection taught viewers something important. Emotional relevance isn't permanent. It has to be maintained through consistency, presence, and accountability. Once it's lost, symbolic gestures can't restore it. Kody's failure wasn't in trying, it was in trying too late, and in the wrong way. And audiences, having watched the slow build-up to this moment, recognize that. From here on, every interaction involving Kody was interpreted through the lens of diminished influence. His words carried less weight. His frustration felt repetitive. His insistence felt disconnected from outcomes. He wasn't driving the story anymore. He was responding to it. That realization altered the tone of the show.
The center of gravity shifted away from managing Kody's emotions and toward watching others move forward without him. And that's when the narrative truly changed. This wasn't just a personal ending, it was a structural one. The Christmas moment didn't end relationships by itself. It revealed that they had already ended in practice. What remained was the adjustment period, the part where everyone learns how to operate without the old hierarchy. Viewers sensed that adjustment happening in real time, and once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. That's why this moment continues to resonate, not because it was dramatic, but because it clarified something that had been murky for years. Kody no longer set the emotional terms, and once that became clear, the rest of the story wrote itself. After that Christmas, the calendar itself changed meaning. Holidays had once been the glue holding fractured relationships together in Sister Wives. Even when things were tense, dates like Christmas forced proximity, conversation, and performance. They required everyone to show up emotionally, even if the connection underneath was strained. That obligation disappeared here. What followed wasn't a dramatic announcement or a formal separation of traditions.
It was quieter than that. Plans stopped being negotiated. Invitations stopped carrying emotional pressure. Togetherness was no longer treated as proof of unity, and that shift mattered more than any argument ever could. Future holidays became simpler, smaller, more intentional. Not everyone was included, and inclusion was no longer framed as moral necessity. Instead of asking, who should be there, the family began asking, what feels peaceful? That question changes everything. The Christmas rejection marked the point where emotional performance ended. No more gathering for optics, no more forcing warmth to prove effort, no more pretending that proximity meant connection. This wasn't bitterness, it was relief. Viewers noticed the difference almost immediately. The tension that used to accompany holidays was gone. There was less anticipation of blow-ups, fewer loaded conversations, fewer scenes built around managing reactions. What replaced them was calm, sometimes awkward, sometimes incomplete, but unmistakably calmer. That calm didn't come from resolution. It came from acceptance. The family had accepted that certain dynamics weren't coming back, and once acceptance sets in, behavior follows. Communication became more direct but also more limited. Not everything needed to be said anymore. Not every feeling needed to be processed aloud. Boundaries did the work words used to do. This was especially evident in how communication changed. There were fewer emotional check-ins, fewer attempts to explain decisions, fewer negotiations around expectations. Silence wasn't treated as a problem to be fixed, it was allowed to exist. That allowance is a sign of emotional maturity. In the past, silence triggered anxiety. It meant something was wrong and needed immediate attention. After this moment, silence became neutral, sometimes even preferable. The family had learned that constant engagement wasn't healing them, it was exhausting them. This realization extended beyond holidays. Everyday interactions followed the same pattern. Conversations became practical rather than emotional. Logistics replaced debates. Decisions were made without seeking approval. And notably, there was less guilt attached to that shift. Guilt thrives in systems where obligation outweighs consent. Once consent became the standard, guilt lost its leverage. For Kody, this shift was particularly stark. He was no longer the person holidays revolved around. He wasn't the emotional focal point or the arbiter of togetherness. Plans happened without him being the center of discussion. That absence wasn't framed as punishment. It was treated as reality. And reality, when accepted, doesn't need justification. Viewers interpreted this change as growth, not just for the family, but for the show itself. The narrative stopped chasing reconciliation that no one wanted. Instead, it began documenting what separation actually looks like when it's handled quietly. That's less dramatic, but more honest. The emotional tone of later gatherings reflected this honesty. There were moments of nostalgia, yes, moments of sadness, but there was also clarity. No one pretended things could go back to how they were. And because of that, expectations were lower, and disappointment was rarer. This is what endings look like when they're complete. They don't demand attention. They don't announce themselves repeatedly. They settle into routine. The Christmas rejection was the catalyst, but the transformation happened afterwards, in how choices were made and how little explanation they required. For viewers, this offered a new lens through which to interpret the family story. Instead of waiting for closure scenes or grand emotional reckonings, they began watching for patterns of peace, for signs that people were choosing what felt sustainable, rather than what looked good. That shift changed engagement. Audiences stopped rooting for reunions. They stopped speculating about reconciliation. They started recognizing the value of boundaries being respected, even when those boundaries meant distance. That recognition reflected broader cultural changes too. Viewers saw their own experiences mirrored back at them. The decision to stop attending certain gatherings, the relief of simplified traditions, the peace that comes from letting go of forced connection. This made the story resonate in a different way. It wasn't just reality TV anymore. It was real life.
By the time subsequent holidays rolled around, the absence of conflict was no longer surprising. It was expected. The family had found a rhythm that didn't rely on emotional theatrics, and while that rhythm didn't look like unity, it looked like honesty. That honesty redefined togetherness. Togetherness was no longer measured by proximity, it was measured by comfort. And comfort, once prioritized, changes everything. The Christmas gift rejection had drawn a line. What followed showed how firmly that line held. There was no backtracking, no testing of boundaries, no attempts to recreate old dynamics. The family moved forward, not together, but aligned in one important way. They stopped pretending. And in doing so, they found something they hadn't had in years: peace. By the time Christmas arrived, the silence was louder than any argument the family had ever had. There were no explosive fights, no screaming matches, no dramatic walkouts caught on camera. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: a quiet, unmistakable emotional separation that everyone could feel but no one wanted to name out loud. Kody felt it first. He tried to mask it with forced optimism, telling himself that the holiday would soften things, that Christmas had always been the glue, the moment when traditions, children, and shared memories could override resentment. For years, that belief had carried him through conflict. This year, it didn't. The gift he chose was meant to be symbolic, not extravagant, not flashy, something he believed would communicate effort without apology. In his mind, it said, "I'm still here. I still matter. We can still fix this." But symbols only work when both people agree on a meaning. Christine didn't. When the gift arrived, there was no excitement, no curiosity, no hesitation, just a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone already knows how they feel but takes a moment to accept it. She didn't open it right away. That detail mattered more than anyone realized. Because Christine had always been expressive, emotional, responsive. Even when she was hurt, she engaged. She reacted, she explained herself. This time, she didn't. The distance wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. By the time the note was read, the emotional outcome had already been decided. The note wasn't long, it wasn't cruel, and that's what made it devastating. It didn't attack, it didn't accuse, it didn't relitigate the past. It simply stated boundaries. It clarified where things stood, and more importantly, where they would not be going. For Christine, this wasn't about punishment, it was about closure. She had spent years explaining her feelings, years asking to be heard, years adjusting herself to fit into a structure that required constant compromise from her and constant control from someone else. The note wasn't written in anger. It was written in peace. And peace, when one person has already moved on, can feel brutal to the person left behind. Kody didn't react the way viewers expected. There was no explosion, no yelling, no dramatic declaration. Instead, there was confusion. He reread the note multiple times, looking for a hidden opening, a line that suggested negotiation, a sentence that implied this was temporary. There wasn't one. That was the moment he realized something fundamental had changed. Christine wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't hoping. She wasn't trying. She was done. For the rest of the family, the rejection of the gift became a quiet turning point. No one said it directly, but everyone felt it. The kids noticed the shift immediately. They didn't ask questions, not because they didn't care, but because they already understood. Children see emotional truth faster than adults. They recognize when someone stops performing a role they've outgrown. And Christine had stopped performing. Robin sensed it too. For years, she had been framed, by viewers and by the family, as the emotional center of Kody's world, the one who received the attention, the one who was protected. But even she could tell this wasn't about jealousy or favoritism anymore. This was about detachment. And detachment is something control cannot fix. Mary, watching from the sidelines, recognized the moment for what it was. She had lived it herself years earlier, the slow realization that effort without reciprocity only deepens loneliness. She didn't comment publicly. She didn't need to. She had already been there. What made the situation even more striking was Christine's demeanor afterward. She didn't gloat. She didn't explain herself repeatedly. She didn't seek validation. She moved forward. And that movement, calm, steady, unbothered, unsettled Kody more than any argument ever had. Because anger invites engagement. Silence signals the end. As Christmas passed, so did the illusion that things could return to how they were. The gift sat untouched. The note lingered.
And for the first time, Kody was forced to confront a truth he had avoided for years. Love cannot be demanded. Respect cannot be negotiated after it's been lost. And once someone stops imagining a future with you, there is nothing left to argue about. The rejection wasn't about the gift. It was about everything the gift could no longer fix. And in that realization, the power dynamic shifted permanently. Christine wasn't walking away loudly. She was walking away completely. And the family, whether they were ready or not, had just crossed a line they would never uncross.
After Christmas passed, nothing rushed in to replace it. No follow-up conversations, no attempts to reinterpret what had happened, no effort to soften the edges of the moment. That's how everyone knew it had changed for good. In the weeks that followed, the family didn't fracture dramatically. It restructured quietly. Schedules shifted, communication narrowed, decisions were made without checking in the way they once were. The old reflexes were gone. And for the first time, that absence felt intentional. Kody noticed it in small ways first. Messages went unanswered longer, plans were shared after they were made, not before. Emotional updates were replaced with logistical ones. Conversations that once would have spiraled into arguments now ended quickly, not because issues were resolved, but because no one was interested in debating them anymore. That's when it hit him. He wasn't being frozen out. He was being phased out. For years, Kody had believed conflict meant connection, that as long as people were reacting, even negatively, he still mattered. But what followed Christmas wasn't conflict. It was neutrality, and neutrality is unforgiving. The family no longer oriented itself around managing his reactions. There was no anticipation of fallout, no emotional buffering, no rehearsing conversations ahead of time. Life simply continued. That's what made it painful. Because pain usually comes with noise, this came with routine. Christine's behavior reinforced it without ever making a statement. She didn't rehash the past, she didn't offer explanations, she didn't revisit the note or the gift. She treated the moment as settled, not something to process again. She had already processed it. That calm unsettled Kody more than anger ever could. Anger would have meant engagement. Calm meant independence. And independence is irreversible once it's chosen. The rest of the family adjusted quickly, not because they were unbothered, but because they had been emotionally preparing for this shift long before Christmas. The holiday didn't cause the change, it synchronized it. Everyone landed in the same place at the same time. The children adapted first. They stopped asking where Kody would be for certain moments. They stopped expecting joint celebrations. They adjusted their emotional expectations quietly, the way children do when they sense adults have stopped pretending. That adjustment mattered, because it showed that the family wasn't in crisis. They were in transition. Robin, watching this unfold, felt the instability of it more than anyone expected. For years, the narrative had positioned her as the constant, the place Kody returned to emotionally. But this shift didn't benefit her. It isolated her. Kody's frustration had nowhere to go. There were no shared spaces left to redirect it. The family system no longer absorbed emotional overflow. That weight settled closer to home. And that changed things. Mary recognized it with painful clarity. She had lived through a similar withdrawal years earlier. The slow realization that presence without connection feels worse than absence. Watching it happen again, from a different angle, confirmed something she already knew. This wasn't temporary. This was the end of a chapter. What followed wasn't dramatic fallout, it was detachment settling into muscle memory. People stopped bracing themselves, stopped hoping for repair, stopped waiting for apologies that would never arrive in the form they needed. They weren't angry, they were finished. For viewers of Sister Wives, this phase felt different too. There was no cliffhanger energy, no sense of what happens next. Instead, there was a steady recognition that what they were watching was aftermath. Aftermath doesn't entertain the same way conflict does, but it tells the truth. Scenes felt quieter, conversations shorter, emotions less reactive, not because people didn't care, but because caring had been redirected inward. That redirection is the real sign of closure. Kody's attempts to reassert relevance during this time fell flat, not because they were malicious, but because they were misaligned. He was still speaking from the past tense, from a version of the family that no longer existed. The family had moved into the present, and the present didn't include negotiating emotional access anymore. This is where many relationships truly end, not with a breakup, but with a redefinition of self. Christine no longer defined herself in relation to Kody's expectations. The rest of the family followed suit in their own ways. No announcement was made. No permission was requested. Life simply reorganized. That reorganization didn't erase history. It reframed it. Past moments were no longer viewed as unresolved conflicts. They became explanations for why the ending made sense. And once an ending makes sense, it no longer hurts the same way.
The gift and the note faded into memory, not as wounds, but as symbols. They marked the moment when effort stopped being persuasive and boundaries started being respected. From here on, nothing needed to be proven. The family wasn't trying to convince Kody of anything. They were living, and that was the hardest truth to accept. Because while Kody searched for meaning in the rejection, the rest of the family had already found it. Not in the note, not in the gift, but in the peace that followed. Peace that didn't require consensus. Peace that didn't require explanation. Peace that simply existed. This phase didn't end the story with fireworks. It ended it with silence. And silence, when it's chosen, is final. In hindsight, this Christmas wasn't remembered for what was exchanged. It was remembered for what wasn't. No reconciliation, no dramatic fallout, no emotional bargaining. Just a moment that quietly closed a door everyone had been circling for years. That's why this scene settled so deeply with viewers of Sister Wives. It didn't feel staged. It didn't feel produced. It felt final in a way reality television rarely allows itself to be. Because reality TV usually thrives on unfinished business. This didn't. The rejected gift and the note didn't create the ending. They revealed it.
They showed that the family had already crossed from conflict into acceptance, from negotiation into self-definition. And once people define themselves without reference to the same center, the structure collapses naturally. No villain needed, no speech required. The power of this moment was in its restraint. Christine didn't explain herself because she no longer needed to be understood by the person she was separating from. Understanding had been replaced by clarity, and clarity doesn't ask permission. Kody's role in the family had been eroding long before Christmas, but erosion is slow. It's easy to ignore until something exposes how much ground has been lost. The gift did that. The note confirmed it. Not because they were rejected harshly, but because they were unnecessary. And unnecessary is the most painful word for someone who wants to find the emotional terms of everything. This moment also redefined how viewers understood endings. Many had been waiting for a dramatic declaration, a final argument, a confrontation, a breakdown. What they got instead was something more honest, a boundary that didn't need reinforcement. That's why it resonated. Because real endings don't always come with shouting. They come when one person stops asking the other to change, stops hoping to be seen differently, stops imagining a future that requires compromise from only one side. Christine had stopped imagining, and once she did, the story changed permanently. The family's new normal wasn't perfect. It wasn't joyful in every moment, but it was stable. It didn't depend on emotional performance or forced togetherness. It allowed people to exist without bracing themselves for fallout. That stability mattered more than reconciliation ever could have. For Kody, the lesson arrived late, but it arrived clearly. Emotional authority doesn't come from position. It comes from consistency, from showing up before gestures are required, from listening before explanations are offered. By the time he reached for symbolism, the relationship no longer responded to symbols. That's not cruelty, that's consequence. And consequences don't negotiate. The show itself shifted after this moment. Storylines stopped orbiting around repair. Episodes felt less reactive, more observational. The tension didn't disappear, it transformed. Instead of asking, can this be fixed, the narrative quietly asked, what does life look like after? That's a harder question to answer, but it's a more honest one. Viewers accepted this ending because it mirrored their own experiences. Many recognized the exact moment when a relationship in their life stopped being a debate and became a decision, when anger gave way to indifference, when effort turned inward instead of outward. That recognition created closure, not just for the family, but for the audience. The rejected gift became symbolic, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. It clarified what years of conversation could not. It showed that emotional access had been revoked, not as punishment, but as protection. And protection, once chosen, isn't reversed casually. This was the true ending of the story people had been watching unfold for seasons. Not the end of a marriage on paper, not the end of filming, but the end of emotional negotiation. Everything after this moment was aftermath. Life reorganizing, identities recalibrating, peace being prioritized over performance. That's why this Christmas scene mattered. It wasn't loud enough to trend forever. It wasn't dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but it was real enough to last.
In a show built on constant conflict, this moment stood out because it refused to escalate. It didn't demand attention. It didn't beg for interpretation. It simply existed. And in doing so, it told the truth. Some relationships don't end because someone gives up. They end because someone grows up. They end when boundaries replace arguments, when clarity replaces hope, when peace replaces permission. This was one of those endings. Not shouted, not celebrated, just accepted. And once accepted, it didn't need to be revisited, because it was over.